First of all, just to introduce myself, my name is Brian Hughes, and I'm from Galway, from NUI Galway, the psychology department. So I'm a psychologist. And I wish to talk a little bit tonight, for about 30 minutes or so, on this particular trial, the PACE trial, which I know some of you will be familiar with. But I want to say that about a month ago, my book that's shown here, and you'll see a few pictures of this over the next few minutes, came out. And within this book, I talk about many things, but I also talk about the PACE trial and the way the science has been done on chronic fatigue syndrome and ME. And many people here have seen this and have read this and have been in touch and so on. And I have to say, I've been overwhelmed by the nobility and integrity of what people have been doing in support of this cause, in support of this, this constituency of people. And it's a matter of some shame on my part that bad science affects people's lives. It's not just a teaching moment for students to understand that a study is not so good. It's not just a hypothetical situation that maybe will be better the next time. But the fact that bad science affects people's lives is a real problem, and it's something that I've been particularly concerned about for some time. I'd like to thank Joan for inviting me to come here today to be a bit of a warm-up act for David's keynote address a little bit later. And what I will do is talk to you about my field, psychology, and the PACE trial, with respect to why I think psychology is in crisis. And this book, which some of you will have seen, simply talks about the different ways in which psychology is in crisis. I'm not the only person to believe that psychology is in crisis, but I'm perhaps most associated with breaking down the crisis, and diagnosing it, and looking at the different aspects to it. Most famously, psychology has been battling with a replication crisis, so I'll talk about that first. But less famously, psychology has been dealing with a variety of other problems as well, all of which are quite serious. And what I've done in this book is I have identified the PACE trial and the ME/CFS controversy within psychology as a beautiful example of psychology in crisis. Every single thing I say about psychology can be said about the PACE trial and the way that this condition has been dealt with. And therefore, I use it as sort of the climax of the whole book. My whole argument about psychology comes to its climax when I talk about the PACE trial. So tonight, I'll just give you a flavor of each of these things, because David will talk to you in detail about the PACE trial, the whole history and sequence of events around that. And I will talk about the different ways in which science went wrong and psychology went wrong with respect to this trial. And for those of you who need a reminder, the PACE trial is a UK-based research study where data was collected from 2005 to 2010. And the concept was that CFS could be treated using cognitive behavior therapy or exercise therapy, and both of those treatments were administered to different groups of people and compared to two other conditions, including a control condition. But suffice to say, the claim was in 2011 that positive change had occurred as a result of cognitive behavior therapy and exercise therapy compared to standard medical care. And in 2013, it was even reported that 22% of patients in the trial who received CBT and or GET actually recovered from chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, suffice to say, this is a problematic conclusion for here today, and also for many psychologists and scientists around the world who read these results with a certain amount of incredulity that such a huge effect could be found, essentially corroborating the claim that chronic fatigue syndrome and ME are essentially psychological or psychogenic at most conditions. That by using a psychotherapy, you are effectively reverse engineering the condition and fixing it because that's the way it works. So you end up with these kinds of headlines, which many of you have seen, that just get out and exercise, say scientists. It's all a bad attitude. That's the problem that everybody has. It's not an organic condition. Okay. I want to put this in the context of the replication concept, the idea that good science is not confined to one single study. Good science, it relies on replication of effects. So that if you have a single study, even if it produces several papers, if it's one empirical study, it is not yet good science. It cannot be good science in isolation. And when a single study is treated as the final word on a topic, then you're not dealing with good science per se, because there's a big issue around replication. And science is a field of empirical study that relies on replication. So psychology, my field, which has been an academic scientific discipline since the 1870s or so, a lot of research has been conducted over the last century and a bit. And just a few years ago, around 2015, this news story came out. Some researchers had established what they felt was a problematic feature in psychology, namely that when they did 100 studies the second time over, most of them didn't find the original results. So most of the studies were in fact null findings, suggesting that only a third of studies actually found the original effect. 2/3 of studies are unreliable. And this was a special effort by a group headquartered in the University of Virginia who were looking to see, is psychology a replicable science? Because if it's not, then things like the PACE trial are immediately questionable, because that's a psychology research study for all intents and purposes. They call it estimating the reproducibility, and I'm going to show you a few pictures here. I understand and I completely appreciate that most people don't want to see loads of numbers and tables and so on, but I will show you some of the original data pictures, and I'll explain them to you as best I can. The original studies, if you were to score studies from 0 to 1, and the lowest score means the clearest finding, the original studies all had very clear findings. But when these researchers decided to replicate the studies, they found that the findings were all over the place. Most of the findings were not clear at all. So the picture just simply indicates that. So psychology got very, very worried that actually what we're teaching students, what we're teaching clinicians about behavioral science, is not replicable. You just pick 100 studies, you do them again, and most of them get you no result at all. So why does that happen? One of the reasons it happens very much with the PACE trial, is what I call rampant methodological flexibility. Unlike chemistry, when you're in high school or in your secondary school, you do experiments, it's according to a curriculum, and you're doing the experiment for the millionth time, because you know that when you dip this chemical into that chemical, it changes color. It's all about replication, and you use the same procedure over and over again to demonstrate the scientific fact. In psychology, there is no one standard way to do a study. So most studies are different. There are no two studies alike, even if they're on the same topic, hence the snowflakes. Even if they're on the same topic, the studies are going to be slightly different. And because there is no standard methodology in psychology research, that means that it's very difficult to control what goes on in the research context. And the PACE trial, as we will see, you took advantage of rampant methodological flexibility in all sorts of ways. Rampant methodological flexibility means you can just simply change the methodology as you go along. You can design the study to suit yourself. If you don't like the data, you can collect some more data to see if you analyze it the second time, will you find something different? And if you like what you see, you can stop collecting data and report your result. That flexibility is not good science. It opens the door to confirmation bias. It opens the door to something that scholars call harking, which is hypothesizing after the results are known. So you see the findings and then you tell the world what you were looking for. It should be the other way around. Moving the goalposts, we'll hear about that a little bit later. Fishing for findings. If you have a lot of data in a computer, you can pull out a fraction of it and report that and make your study look very strong when in fact most of the data don't show anything. And method blaming, which means that if your study finds something different to the other guy's study, well, you can say, well, it's because they're different methods, because no two studies are alike. Whereas if you find the same result as the previous guy, you can say, we've replicated each other, we've done good science. So you win either way, whether you replicate or you don't. You can say you're doing good science. So the PACE trial then. What's the basic problem with the PACE trial in scientific terms? Is that when you have this open-ended flexibility, you end up with studies that are weak by design. Now, studies that rely on self-report data require a thing called blinding. In other words, if a self-report data is where you tell the scientist what's going on. They're not measuring it with a thermometer or a blood test or a weighing scale. Yeah.
The screen's coming up white on the live recording.
Okay.
I'm just going to try and switch off one light, so carry on.
Yes, absolutely.
I can see it.
Yeah. Okay, so the blinding is where, excuse me, self-report data is where you basically fill out a questionnaire. It's you are responsible for providing the data, not the scientist or the researcher. And you need blinding, which I think many people are aware of. Blinding is when, in a therapy study, for example, you don't tell the participant what the therapy is supposed to do. You don't tell the participant that they're in the good therapy group instead of the bad therapy group. You don't tell the participant they're in the control group. You come up with a way of hiding that information from the participant so that their self-reports don't become biased by expectation. Because if you're told over and over again, you're getting a fantastic therapy, this is wonderful, when you fill out the question, and the therapy is cognitive behavior therapy, so it's kind of telling you you're supposed to think positively about stuff. So when you fill out the questionnaire, you're going to say, oh, the therapy was wonderful, I'm feeling a lot better now. That's a lack of blinding. So all studies involving self-report require blinding. The PACE trial heavily relied on self-report, but the PACE trial did not have blinding. And for a student, we would just simply say, this is an example of a bad study, straight off the bat, without looking at the data, just looking at the methods, just looking at the basic setup. That's not a good study. So when you have flexible, non-standardized methods, you make the study design up yourself, you open the door to unconscious biases by the researchers, perhaps conscious biases in some cases, but largely unconscious biases, and people have this type of problem. So the PACE trial, people will talk to you about the PACE trial in nuts and bolts. We hear all the details, a few details here and lots of details from David. The PACE trial is full of problems, but I will simply say this, even if you knew nothing more about the PACE trial except that it's a non-blinded trial based on self-report, you know enough to know that you cannot rely on that trial. That trial is not a good study. By definition, no matter what the researchers say, no matter what journal has published it, no matter how people defend it, it's fundamentally flawed on that level. It's self-report, but it doesn't blind. Therefore, you've got expectancy bias, psychology 101. And people criticize psychologists, but actually I think what has gone on here is that people have done a study under the manner of psychology, but they've forgotten their basic psychology. They have forgotten what they were taught as undergraduates. They are not scientists in psychology, they're clinicians doing studies, and that's a very, very different thing. Okay. Now, let me walk you through this very simple because this is the most, it's almost funny what they do in relation to this. When they planned the study, they say, we're going to measure recovery. We're going to measure it a few different ways. And I'll just narrow it down because we don't have all the time in the world. And there are many, we can speak for hours about the PACE trial. But they said, for example, you have to fill out a questionnaire about physical fatigue. And if you get a score of 85 or higher, that means you've recovered. Secondly, we're going to give you a different fatigue score. And if you get 3 out of 11, which equates my mental arithmetic 27 out of 100, that means you've recovered. Self-reported, so we're going to ask you how you are. And if you tick the box saying very much better, that means you've recovered. And fourthly, we're going to get a clinician to look at you. And if they say that you've recovered according to all criteria that have been listed, then that means you've recovered. Okay, so they ran the study for 5 years collecting data. Obviously, somebody applied this logic to the data set for reasons which will become clear. But it was never published in this form. And only after the data were revealed, which is a story in itself we'll hear a bit about later, researchers discovered, independent researchers analyzing the original data found that only 7% of people could be said to have recovered using these criteria. That's quite disappointing in any clinical context. So, what do the researchers do? Well, they decided to just go with something different. So, between collecting the data and publishing the paper, they changed the criteria. They decided now, you only needed 60 on the first questionnaire, not 85. 60 would be recovery. Okay? 18, basically 55% on the second scale instead of 27% would be recovery. Tick the box much better, we'll call you recovered as well. Because only a small number of people said very much better, so we'll include the much betters and then we'll bump it up that way. And okay, the clinician says you recovered according to these criteria, but not according to those criteria. We'll throw you into the pile of recoveries as well. And on that basis, they were able to report 22% recovery because they moved the goalposts. And the problem for them is, and they will never be able to avoid this problem, is that they published their intentions before data collection. So we all know that they moved the goalposts. We all know that when they published the study, excuse me, I'm disappearing from the internet. We all know that the protocol was published, and therefore we know that they moved the goalposts. Okay. And there's another problem here that we call the winner's curse, which is when we do lots of studies or a study with lots of bits, the temptation is to look at the bits that worked, publish that, and quietly forget about the other bits. So you end up with journals full of research papers that show interesting findings, but they're flukes. The boring findings, the null findings, they're in the researcher's file drawer. We call that the file drawer problem. And there is a case to be made that in the PACE trial, when they published the plan for the study, there was a lot in it about using actometer data, sort of mechanical devices that would independently record physical activity, that you wouldn't be relying on people to self-report their physical activity. But they never published that data. That data undoubtedly said that the interventions were of no good, no use. So we look at that in a moment. But they didn't publish that data, they put it in the file drawer. So partial publication is bad science. And that's what we get underlying psychology's replication crisis and all over the PACE trial. Okay, let me just walk you through some of the other different crises, apart from the basic lack of replicability. One is, because this is a very important one, and we were having a conversation a bit about this earlier, about expectancies and biases and theoretical positions that clinicians and scientists and doctors have that affect their decision making. And so I call this in psychology's paradigmatic crisis, but it's the theory crisis essentially. Psychology has many different bits to it. Most people have heard of Freud and psychoanalysis. That's completely different to, say, social psychology or cognitive psychology, which is, these are just different ways of looking at behavior. And you can argue the Wikipedia page lists 45 different types of psychology, but I'm just mentioning 6 of them on this slide. And really, the simplest way to look at this is the biggest divide is between the people who see human beings and psychology as a biological subject and people who see human beings and psychology as a purely social act. Interventions, therefore, should be talk therapy, not drug therapy or physical therapy. So this divide between the biological worldview and the social worldview is a big factor that affects the debate and the discussion on ME and CFS. Last month we saw Jose Montoya presenting in detail the large body of evidence to demonstrate without doubt that ME-CFS is an organic condition. It's not all in the mind. It's not caused by thought patterns or attitudes. It's an organic condition. There's so many different pointers to that. Yet, the history, especially in the UK, of ME/CFS is dominated by the other theory, the Challenger theory, which is that things are in the mind, pure and simple. They're not in the brain or in the body. And the initial paper that is quoted in all the histories of ME/CFS, ME perhaps in particular, was in the British Medical Journal in 1970 and January the 3rd, practically the 1960s. And they, from their desks, wrote about, without interviewing any patient, wrote about all the different outbreaks of ME that had been documented. And they concluded that they spotted patterns. And one of the patterns was that it was mostly women. And it's mostly women's institutions, the hospitals with lots of nurses, or employers with lots of women employees. They were the places, just the sort of institution where you would expect mass hysteria. And they concluded that ME was actually mass hysteria. All the outbreaks could be explained by people's minds running away with them. And they explicitly stated in the paper that it was a combination of clinical misjudgment and hysteria among the, and the reason for this is because doctors made mistakes and it was mostly women. And in the 1970s, late 1960s, to say that mostly women have this condition, it makes it a psychiatric condition, a claim by women that they are sick rather than a real illness. And that's very influential today. So that is the opposite theory to what we have from Jose Montoya and colleagues about the organic and biological factors. The PACE trial, the original study had 3 principal investigators. And all of them have a working history of promoting cognitive behavior therapy and cognitive non-biological theories in their field. Each of them have published books prior to the PACE trial, ever beginning, and they show their hand. Their view is that cognitive behavior therapy is a cure for lots of things. Cure for example, chronic fatigue. This is before they collected data on the matter. They were convinced that this was the case. So the risk here is that there is a bias, what we call a therapeutic allegiance in these people, that they were so wedded to their theories that they preempted the data and interpreted all the data in a weird way to justify their prior assumptions. Okay, so that's a human failing. We're all prone to it. It's called confirmation bias. We do it all the time when we buy the product that really worked and we ignore the products that we'll never know whether it would have worked better or not, but we claim that the one we got is the best one because it's the one we chose. We are guilty of confirmation bias all the time, even when we have little grounds to draw conclusions. One of the problems here is that we know from people who've looked at this in psychology research is that if you have a strong expectancy about your research, you're more likely to have the finding that you were looking for. And one big problem here is that the PACE trial has not been independently verified or independently replicated. All the studies, all the papers emanating from the PACE trial dataset are by the same network of people. They're all connected. There's a sort of a family resemblance or a family connectedness between all the people involved. And we know from the patterns of results when you look at research that when research is replicated by the same researchers, mostly it gets replicated well. The fail rate is low. But when research is replicated by independent researchers, the fail rate is much, much higher. I think I have a laser pointer thing. I don't want to... Oops, okay. Yeah, I think it's there. Okay. When independent investigators do studies, they have a much higher fail rate. In other words, they don't find the same findings over and over again. And that psychology studies, and these are psychology researchers doing psychology studies, the risk is, and the researchers have to acknowledge this, because it's a demonstrable pattern that independent replications tend to fail. So we wait to see what other researchers will do in terms of PACE-type studies But heretofore, we have one study and lots of papers written by the same people who have a therapeutic allegiance that's declared before the study was even conducted. You can't defend that. You can't stand over that. It's not good science. Okay, very quickly through the final few points, because these are smaller points in general terms. Psychology also has a measurement crisis. It is difficult to measure a thought. It is difficult to measure a feeling or an attitude. It's difficult to measure a personality. And yet this is what psychology is about. And just because something is difficult doesn't mean that any approach will do. You really have to do a lot of work to verify and corroborate and triangulate and get good measures. And there are ways of doing that in psychology. And you can talk about different approaches and debate them. But it seems to me that the PACE trial doesn't seem to go to that much effort to look at those options. And what we see as an overall pattern in the PACE trial is that self-report measures they show kind of murmurings of something is happening. Now, there's a big problem with some of the self-report measures, and I haven't revealed that yet, but we'll come to that in a moment. Subjective fatigue, okay, yeah, the subjective fatigue score was different. Some people had lots of fatigue, other people had not. The point is that the recovery factors in terms of fatigue was only present for self-report. When they used other methods, like testing people to see how far they could walk, doing a medical test, they found they were just as fatigued as they were before the therapy. Okay, so the low bar there is objective measures of physical activity. A couple of other examples. The walking test for the people who were supposed to be recovered on PACE showed that people could walk no more than a few hundred meters before they needed to rest. And that is the threshold we would expect of a congestive heart failure patient who would be waiting for surgery, either a lung transplant or a heart transplant. The level of physical abilities in these so-called recovered patients was very, very low. Some folks did look at the economic factors, and they found that the disability payments to these recovered patients was actually higher after the PACE trial, after they had recovered, than before. Okay, so those types of clever, independent, objective measures showed no recovery. It was only the self-report measures that showed recovery. And that's emblematic of a measurement problem. And it's bad science, it's bad psychology to rely on, it's kind of gullible to rely on pure self-report as your only source of information. Okay, a regular study would triangulate. They would use the objective measure to either allow or disallow the subjective measure. But that's not what they do in PACE. They just report the subjective measures as though that's real data. Okay, the statistical crisis. Nobody likes statistics, and that's the crisis, essentially. That's the problem. I mentioned earlier that, this is a bit wordy, but I will explain it because it's actually funny. I mentioned it earlier that the researchers moved the goalposts. They lowered the threshold of, say, subjective fatigue in order to make it easier. Well, this is not necessarily the reason they did it, but this was the effect of it. It made it easier for patients to be classified as having recovered. They explain why they did this, because when you do that, when you move the goalposts, as the cliche suggests, it looks like cheating. So they have to defend themselves. And in the written report in the journal, they said that the reason they did this is because they pitched it too high to begin with. They were asking too much of patients. They were saying that if you had a score of 85, half the population wouldn't have a score of 85, is what they said in writing. Okay? And they literally point out that threshold would mean that approximately half the general working age population would fall outside the normal range. So they said, we got it wrong. We should never have said 85. That's why we're reducing it to 60. But they based this conclusion on prior data showing that the average score was 85. But it was the mean average. Now, I don't want to be patronizing, but in school, we learn the difference between the mean, the median, and the mode. And on this scale, this fatigue scale, this general functioning scale, the mean is 85, but the median is close to 100. So it is simply inaccurate to say most people score either 95 or better on this scale. It's inaccurate to conclude that just because the average, the mean average, is down at around the 85 point, that this means that half the population are above and half the population are below. Okay, the mean average number of arms for a human being is close to 2, but it's not quite 2. It's a little bit below because some people have one arm and some people have no arms, okay? That doesn't mean that half the population are above the average and half the population are below, which means that only half the population have 2 arms and the other half have some fewer number. That's not the way means work. Okay, you understand the point I'm making? So they moved the goalposts because they said that half the population would be above this old threshold, or half the population would be below, so it's not fair. That's innumeracy. Okay, and innumeracy is, as I say in the book, it's a socially acceptable form of ignorance. It's unlike illiteracy, where you wouldn't employ somebody who can't spell, but we regularly employ people who can't count. And there's a big problem with statistics in science and in psychology, and this is a glaring one. Okay, let me just show you a different picture. This is all the fatigue scores for the general population, all the different age ranges. Everybody would score up close, above 90, close to 100. So it's wrong to say half the population scores 85 or below. This is people age 85 and above. Yeah, okay, their physical activity, abilities, and fatigue, and so on is much lower. The PACE trial entry criterion was 65. So in order to be considered sick enough to take part, you had to have a score of 65. But in order to be considered recovered in the published paper, a score of 60 will do. Which means your score could go down and you would be considered to have improved. Now, there's few problems in measurement worse than it doesn't matter which direction it goes in to tell you that you've improved. But this is literally the case in point. And there were multiple participants, not a whole lot, but there were multiple, it wasn't unheard of, participants whose score actually went down, and yet they were classified as having recovered because they were poorly enough to be recovered, but healthy enough to participate. It's perverse in that sense. Okay, so big problem there. Let me just say a word a little bit on bad habits in psychology generally that are applied to the PACE study. And this is a problem that generally happens, is that researchers often talk about how sure they are of their finding rather than how significant or how important their finding is. So in research, everything comes down to statistics, and we declare the study to be a success if the findings are statistically significant. You'll encounter these terms. Some people talk about, don't forget about the effect size. Okay, what does that all mean? Well, it talks about how likely is it that your finding is real. That's the first factor. And how important is your finding is the second factor. And any study can be described in these terms. And both can be low or high. So ideally, your finding would be very likely and very important. In a bad situation, your finding is unimportant and unlikely, okay? But there are also other options. Important but unlikely, and likely but important, and that's where the PACE trial falls. Even if you give them a pass on the arithmetic problem, if you pretend that doesn't exist, if you believe that 22% of people recovered, what happened? What happened is they recovered by a tiny amount. The effect size is minute. It's small to moderate. In other words, it's not a meaningful effect in clinical terms. However, it's very likely. Okay? So what that means is that statistically we can say they say it definitely happened because they have the statistic to prove it. But what happened is the real question. And what happened was a small improvement in self-reported symptomology. Okay? So in psychology, there's an obsession with this notion of statistical significance, which is all about how likely it was the thing happened. But the thing that happened can be very important or not important at all. And psychology never talks about that. There are lots of people who say we should, but psychology remains obsessed, and as a lot of clinical disciplines actually, epidemiology, public health medicine, a lot of studies in these fields obsess with statistical significance and say the study has worked if the finding is very likely, even if the effect being observed, the treatment success being observed is very small. So that is a problem in lots of studies, not just PACE. Very quickly, the sampling crisis. In psychology, we tend to look at weird populations. That is to say, Western, educated, industrialized, R, I've forgotten, and D, I've forgotten. I'm drawing a blank here. It's not right-handed, but it might as well be. But we look at subsets of the population. And that's a big problem if you're talking about human behavior, because human behavior occurs across the population. And if you look at clinical settings, studies can be critiqued in terms of how representative they are. That's what we call sampling. And the PACE trial uses the Oxford criteria for determining whether or not people had ME or CFS, but actually there are many other criteria, as you're probably aware. And for example, the Canadian consensus criteria are different. And they say if you have a comorbidity, if you have another condition, then you might not have CFS, and therefore you should be excluded. And in the PACE trial, 47% of people wouldn't meet the Canadian consensus criteria for CFS. So if the PACE trial was funded and conducted in Canada, half the participants wouldn't even be in the study because they wouldn't be diagnosed with CFS. So sampling is a big problem in psychology and behavioral research, and it's loud and clear in the PACE trial as well. You cannot simply generalize from this study to the general population or to everybody with a diagnosis, because there are peculiarities in how these people were selected. And very finally then, it all culminates in a notion of exaggeration. So even when you break it down, when you step back, there's an awful lot of information in the PACE trial, but when you step back and draw a picture, this is what people come up with. These are independent researchers who have taken the findings and drawn a picture, and each line represents before and after for the different groups in the study. And what you can tell, and you don't need to be a mathematician to tell it, is that they're all on top of each other. The lines are on top of each other. No group, CBT, GET, or control, no group stands out as having improved much better than all the others. So even if you just step away from all the noise and all the debate and just look at the findings as they are, they're very, very modest. And this is what I refer to as an exaggeration crisis. Psychologists and clinical professionals, they want therapies to work. And there's a big problem in therapy research, not just psychotherapy research, of over-optimistic interpretations of rather banal data. And the PACE trial is a case in point. It's an example of exaggeration. It's quite interesting. I wrote a piece about this in the UK's Psychologist magazine, not about the PACE trial, but about the exaggeration crisis in psychology. And it's interesting the feedback you get. People don't necessarily want you to suggest that we're not as good as we think we are. We exaggerate. But it's a human failing, and we shouldn't let it interfere with science. And what we have is that even in relation to the crisis in psychology, which is well recognized, psychology is a strong discipline when it's done well. It has huge potential to change lives and to improve lives. But if it's done badly, there's nothing more destructive, because everybody runs off and interprets things wrongly and applies it in their daily life, and you get all sorts of controversies and challenges. So it's very important that psychology is done right. Psychology affects education policy, health policy, social policy, sentencing in court cases. Psychological research talks about how culpable people are in criminal contexts and how much they should be held accountable for their acts and so forth. Psychology research has all of these impacts on society, and when it's done badly, therefore, it has all these negative impacts on society. My sense is that psychologists simply look at psychology in the way this famous dog does. The house is on fire, but they sit there going, this is fine, this is fine. So we see the problems, but let's not overreact. That's the kind of feeling that I get from a lot of psychologists. We hear what you're saying, we like the book, it's got a nice cover, but let's not dwell on the negative, eh? That's a real attitude, which is not a professional or scientific attitude, but it's a human one. But in psychology, the human attitudes do tend to intrude and tend to take over. So in a nutshell, therefore, psychology is full of potential, full of strengths, but the PACE trial and the ME controversies, the CFS controversies, they put psychology in a negative light. It's very strange for me because I go to a lot of psychology conferences. In the Stormont conference a couple of weeks ago, it's very sobering and very interesting to me to see firsthand people who have not positive things to say about psychology. Psychologists are good at mixing with psychologists, and they don't hear this. It's a type of shame, I feel, when I hear my profession being talked about as a source of damage and a source of arrogance and a source of delusion that affects people's lives. The PACE trial, as we will hear a bit more about the sort of the history of it and the histrionics of it, is doggedly defended to this day by psychologists, but by some psychologists, but not by all. And I wouldn't like you to think that all psychologists have circled the wagons here. There's a lot of skepticism about bad science and psychology, and a lot of concern that these types of cases get defended, sometimes at the highest level. But things are changing. There's a whole new generation of people coming up who don't like that, and they want it more open and more democratized and more clear. And the idea that you can do a study, collect data, and then not share the data, that's taboo. And yet it happened with the PACE trial. But hopefully those days will pass, and we will see some more good science in psychology, because I really do think that psychology has a lot to offer the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, I won't keep you any more. Thank you very much for your time and attention again.
I was really delighted to find out that Brian was going to come here and also present, and he's much more of a researcher and scientist than I am, and I'm also terrible technologically, so I just have text, unfortunately, because I can't do pretty things on PowerPoint. So anyway, I'm going to go a little more into detail about some of, whether the PACE trial is good science. We know it's not. I've called it repeatedly a piece of crap. I've also used worse expressions for it. I'm known for getting up in public lectures and tearing the PACE trial into pieces and throwing the pieces in the air. I'm not going to do that tonight. So this is me. I'm at University of California at Berkeley, and I was a journalist for many decades, 30 years, I guess, and then I got a public health degree. And so now, basically, I'm stayed at Berkeley, and I've been working on this project for about 3 years. I had a change. This is from a slide I did in the spring. I have conflicts of interest. I should say conflicts of interest. 1,008 is how many people contributed to my crowdfunding last year. So actually this year I have about 950 something contribute to my last crowdfunding, which is funding my work right now. So why are those conflicts of interest? Michael Sharp, one of the PACE authors, during my crowdfunding last April, did me a big favor and posted a link to my crowdfunding page, a slide about my crowdfunding, a blog about my crowdfunding, and said, this is what people who want to do good research have to put up with. Immediately after that, many people started giving me more money, and thanked Michael Sharp for reminding them to give me money. So yes, I have conflicts of interest. However, I will say that my conflicts of interest are totally transparent. Michael Sharp has said that I have been being paid by patients to trash the PACE trial. I pointed out that actually I was trashing the PACE trial for free for a couple of years before I asked anybody for money. And I only asked people for money because changes at my position in Berkeley. I was doing this as a public service project, and I couldn't afford to do that anymore once my Berkeley money kind of went away, and so I crowdfunded. So to Michael Sharp, that's a conflict of interest. I say my conflicts are transparent and I'm totally open about them. And yes, patients funded me, but I'm right and they're wrong, 100%. So, that's where we are. So here are my questions. One of the things that's kept me fascinated with this, and Brian talked about some of these issues. This is a study where participants had already met outcome thresholds for both primary outcomes at baseline. Since this is impossible in the real world, you can't be recovered and disabled at the same time on breast cancer or HIV. So you can't be recovered. If you're recovered and disabled at the same time on an outcome measure, your study is screwed. You cannot do that. It is not a good study. So is there a place in science for which participants were simultaneously disabled and recovered, or within normal range, as they called that analysis in The Lancet? Why is a study containing this really incredible, bizarre paradox that I've asked the PACE authors repeatedly and the Lancet editor, can you please point me to another study in the literature in which people have simultaneously met an outcome measure and not met it at the same time, or have met the outcome threshold at baseline? Such studies don't exist, and if they did exist in any normal disease, they would never have been published, they would never have passed peer review, and once it was pointed out, they would be retracted in 10 seconds. And once it was pointed out in a major investigation, it would have been reported worldwide on the front pages. That didn't happen with the PACE trial. So patients have been pointing this out since years before I got involved, since the trial was published. Since 2011, and then when the recovery paper was published in 2013, they again pointed out that patients were recovered at baseline on the two main variables for the trial. Apparently, it's very controversial for me as well to be saying this, and I am astonished that this is a controversial concept. I've been astonished that I've been accused of libel, I've been accused of all sorts of things, and not from these authors, but from a researcher at the pediatrician at the University of Bristol. Her vice chancellor has filed multiple complaints with my university about my work. They can't point out anything I've done wrong. They just seem to not like what I'm doing because I'm pointing out flaws in their research. So I'm astonished that to point out that you cannot be recovered and disabled simultaneously on an outcome measure in a study is a controversial thing apparently to be doing, especially in the UK, especially with these particular people who seem to have some sort of power and authority that is beyond me. I don't understand it. And these are the questions that have really been driving me for the last 3 years because I find it actually fascinating, and it's a case of mass delusion in the entire, as far as I can tell, UK academic and medical establishment, the Lancet, the journals, the NHS, the guidance from NICE. People have looked at this study and they still think it's okay. I can't even tell you how insane this has made me. I've been doing this for 3 years. You'll see in the course of my talk, I'll get very agitated because I just cannot believe it. And I'm a healthy, robust 61-year-old guy, and they've driven me insane by this, black is white, up is down nonsense for 3 years. It's beyond me to actually imagine being a patient like many of you, confronting this incredible nonsense, or for parents confronting this incredible nonsense for decades. It's just insane. And I'm sure you've all been driven much more insane to a certain degree than me. Again, I just cannot believe this. And when I showed this study to my colleagues at Berkeley, they're like, nobody can believe some of the things that went on in the study. There are some of the flaws that, which we'll go through. And I want to say that I wrote a 15,000-word investigation of this that I published, I got into this 3 years ago on a site called Virology Blog, which is a well-regarded science site run by a colleague of mine from a virologist at Columbia. And, I didn't plan to spend, the next 3 years of my life doing this. It just didn't occur to me that you could write something like what I wrote and that people could just ignore it, or the journal could just ignore it, and these flaws could be exposed, and somehow it doesn't matter. It's very bizarre. So the history, Brian talked about the 1955 outbreak. It's not 100% clear. We don't really know what that was. I think the idea that it was mass hysteria is preposterous, especially on the basis that most of the people were women. We don't know if it was the same thing, if it was something different. We don't know whether the earlier outbreaks that appeared to be what they were either, because nothing, no pathogen was identified. We just have the descriptives histories of people from that. It was the WHO put it in its neurological category in 1969. 1970, the paper that Brian talked about was written, which reclassified it as mass hysteria. So in 1988, the CDC investigated, or in the mid-80s, the CDC investigated, that's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States, the CDC, it's our major public health agency. They investigated an outbreak in Lake Tahoe, many of you know this, and they decided to call it chronic fatigue syndrome, which is probably the worst name anybody has ever given any illness, as many of you have experienced. And I experienced that too. Oh, I'm so tired, you know, I'm also tired. It sort of lends itself to trivialization and just not taking this seriously, which may have been the intent. In the UK, after that, Simon Wesley, or Sir Simon, I should say, and colleagues, I didn't realize I was calling him Sir Wesley. I kept getting the nomenclature wrong, so I was calling him Sir Wesley, and then someone told me, no, it's Sir Simon. Anyway, he and colleagues wrote a paper where they the first time, as far as I could tell, where they described this vicious cycle of deconditioning, false illness beliefs. People think they're sick, then they get, you know, they stay in bed. They don't get better, then they get more deconditioned, then they get, you know, sleep dysfunction because of that. And one of their colleagues actually once described it as very bad jet lag. So, or akin to very bad jet lag. So that was the start of that. Then in the 90s and early aughts, I guess we call them, they did small-scale studies of cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy, and then they got funding for PACE in 2003, and they started it in 2005. As Brian points out, they wrote a very detailed protocol, although they published it not in 2007, I guess it was. But they wrote it before, and it was approved. And when you write a protocol, you outline all your measures. You say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do that, and you're not supposed to change them. And if you do change them, it's supposed to be for sort of extraordinary reasons. You have to have a good reason for it, not, oh, we thought about it and we like our other outcome measures better, which is essentially what they did. And if you do that in a study, you actually are supposed to provide your original findings or do a kind of a sensitivity analysis which will allow you to determine how much impact the changes had. That was something the PACE authors never did. They refused to do it. When patients wanted them to, they called them vexatious. So PACE started 2011. They published their Lancet paper. 2013, they published a recovery paper. So the Lancet was about improvement and other things. It wasn't about recovery. The reason I think probably was because they needed another 2 years to figure out what they needed to do to have some recovery, because as Brian pointed out in the reanalysis, the recovery rates were, for all 4 groups, were 7% around, between 4 and 7%, and there was no statistically significant difference between any of the groups. In other words, no one recovered from these treatments, period. So there are more than 20 case definitions. I don't need to go through all of them. The one they used primarily was the Oxford criteria. That was what the main criterion, which is basically 6 months of unexplained fatigue. Now, you don't have to be that intelligent to figure out that 6 months of unexplained fatigue is likely to be a proxy for undiagnosed depression, undiagnosed anxiety disorders, what we call idiopathic chronic fatigue for reasons we don't know. If you can find an actual illness associated with it, then you exclude those people. But fatigue and pain are basically the 2 most common symptoms that patients tend to present with to a general practitioner. So if that's your category, that's going to be a problem in your sampling, as Brian points out. The CDC criteria, we all probably know about that. It's a little more specific. You have to have 4 of 8 symptoms, but you don't have, and post-exertional malaise, which is the cardinal symptom as we know, you don't have to have that. It's in the 8 symptoms for the CDC definition, but it's not required. You might have 4 other symptoms. So again, the CDC definition doesn't necessarily pick out the people you want. NICE guidance has 6 months of unexplained fatigue. I think it's 4. I think that may be wrong. But anyway, you have to have just 1 of 10 other symptoms, but at least in the NICE guidance, the post-exertional malaise is supposed to be a characteristic of the fatigue. So if people are actually diagnosing properly, that might pick people out. And then you have a couple of more a 2003 definition, the Canadian consensus criteria. You also have a 2011 definition, the international consensus criteria. Those are both much more specific, and they have much more detailed descriptions of the symptoms and a more detailed description of what post-exertional malaise is and how you might measure that. And then the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine in the US, came up with this weird name, SEID, Systemic Exertion Intolerance Disease, that nobody likes the name, and there's other problems because it doesn't exclude primary depression and primary psychiatric disorders. Well, it includes some, it excludes some, but primary depression is not necessarily excluded. However, it did put the focus on post-exertional malaise, which are called exertion intolerance, as the cardinal symptom of the illness. So that was a good thing about the IOM report. So, okay, here I go. And at the same time as the Institute of Medicine report, we had the report from a panel formed by the National Institutes of Health, which recommended that the Oxford criteria be retired because they felt that it harmed research because it generated these very kind of heterogeneous samples. And the problem with science is that if you have a heterogeneous sample, you really can't find anything because everybody's got something different going on, especially if some people have the illness in question and other people don't. And the other problem with the generic 6 months of fatigue is that, in fact, exercise and psychotherapy basically do help people with depression and do help people with anxiety disorders. So you might get, if you're calling those people as having chronic fatigue syndrome or ME, might look like they're being helped. It might look like the group is being helped if you get those results, and then you can misapply that to the people with more specifically defined ME, even though the people in the study who might have gotten better were those with not ME but depression or anxiety disorders. So basically, these two reports in 2015 were really critical, not so much with the specific things that they said, and they each have some problems, but with the fact that they both very firmly said, this is an organic disorder. This has, of course, there are associated, psychological things, because if you have an illness that nobody believes, you're likely going to get depressed, or you might get depressed. So it wasn't that there was no association with depression or other things, but that it was fundamentally an organic illness, and it basically, in terms of its etiology, it had nothing to do with depression and anxiety or psychiatric issues. It was an organic disease. People have multiple things going wrong. It's not clear exactly what and why, but that's the project now, is to sort of get closer to that. And hopefully there's good research going on to do that. So PACE, they called PACE the definitive trial of these two treatments, cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy, for this illness. So Brian already talked about some of these things, so I don't need to go into it so much, but this kind of basic idea that you have an open label trial where everybody knows what they're getting, and then you ask them at the end, do you feel better? And they say yes. If they're in a therapeutic arm in which part of the modality is to tell people, which they did constantly, at least in the trial manuals, this is going to make you better. You read the manuals for the cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy, they're full of sentences like, this has already been proven to show that this is effective. So, if some people are getting essentially nothing, or they're getting something called adaptive pacing therapy, which was their version of pacing, and they're not told it's going to make them better. And then you have these other two arms where people are told it's going to make them better. And then in 6 months, you ask them, all the groups, do you feel better? It doesn't take a genius like my President Trump, who's, has the highest IQ of anybody on the planet. Even he could figure out, probably, that would make people, you're more likely to have people say, yes, I feel better. Especially if when all the objective measures in the trial, as in PACE, do not match that, and you sort of toss those out. I mean, they actually tossed those out and said, well, those couldn't be right. They basically said, well, yes, we chose these objective measures, but actually we think they're not objective after all. They actually said that. I mean, they disavowed the objectivity of the objective measures they had selected, or not, 3 of them, anyway, 3 of the 4, they disavowed the objectivity of them. You can't do that. It's insane. You cannot do that. It's just wrong. It's really, I will make an argument that really this really meets a lot of criteria for research misconduct, okay? Apparently that also is very controversial to say, but I think this is research misconduct. I'm not the one who has to make that final adjudication, but as I look at what they did, it looks very much like research misconduct to me. Okay, that's my opinion. That's what I've been saying. So we have these 4 arms, and it's based on a completely unproven theory that about deconditioning, dysfunctional cognitions. You know, you all know this theory. You think you're sick, you go to bed for too long, then you're deconditioned, then you try to do something and you're even more deconditioned. So, oh my God, the illness is getting worse. So the point of the therapies is to alleviate you, to either get you back to recondition you, or to alleviate you of the false or the unhelpful illness belief that you actually have an illness that's going to make you worse if you engage in your regular activities. So there's a lot of biomedical research going on now, at least in the US. There's been some improvement in terms of the NIH funding from the National Institutes of Health, and there are sort of different groups in the US doing studies. I mean, here you can see in Australia, where I was in the spring, University of Melbourne's doing some good research, and Griffith University's doing research. So there's a bunch of groups all sort of looking at different things. It's kind of like the blind man and the elephant. Nobody really knows exactly what to look for. Jose Montoya was here. You heard about that. He's very interested in the inflammatory processes, so he's looking at cytokines. One idea is that there's this acute infection, which most people seem to get it after an acute viral infection, glandular fever, or what we call mononucleosis, or a bad flu, or some other. Studies show that a certain percentage of a number of different kinds of infectious diseases will leave 10% or a certain percentage with prolonged disability. So something is triggering something wrong in the body. So this infection is triggering some sort of inflammatory infectious process that seems to continue after the infection passes. There seemed to be a disruption of metabolic processes, so basically people are maybe at the cellular level not producing sufficient energy in the mitochondria. It's not quite clear what's going on. There's indications from different groups. And again, one of the problems is nobody quite knows how to define it exactly, so it's hard to find stuff because everybody's looking at a slightly different subgroup and everybody's using a slightly different definition, and even the subgroups, if you define everybody one way, the definitions may not be that specific, so you may still have people in it. It's not like, HIV, you can just do a test, somebody has HIV, somebody has cancer, whatever. This is different. When you're defining something by symptoms, it can be very complicated because they're symptoms and they're not necessarily, we don't have blood tests and so on. So it's probably a spectrum of multiple things, and we don't really know exactly how many. Maybe it's a cluster of 10 things, or maybe less, or who knows. I think that's part of the project, and we don't know exactly. A lot of people talk about mold. That might be a factor. Environmental exposures. Some people experience a big, if you have a big trauma, that creates a lot of stress. Car accident. Or it might be a combination of these things. So that's all has to be worked out, and maybe all of those particular etiologies, that may, for each person, be a slightly different illness. So it's complicated. So here, these are the primary places where these biomedical things are going on. In the UK, we know, Oxford, King's College, Queen Mary University of London, where Peter White was, who was the primary PACE investigator. The Netherlands has a couple of spots. Australia's also got its own CBT, GET cabal at the University of New South Wales. So this is a long thing. We don't really need to go through the whole thing, but basically they published the Lancet paper in 2011. They published a recovery paper in 2013. 2015 was the NIH and IOM reports. I will say 2015 was also when I published my 15,000 word expose that I thought would be the end of the thing. That would trigger actually some response. It just triggered a lot of silence from these people. So then Lancet Psychiatry, right after I published my big thing, Lancet Psychiatry published a completely bogus study of long-term follow-up, which I don't need to go into, but it basically totally misinterpreted the data in a way that was completely favorable to them. So basically they said that this shows that the sustained benefit after 2 years, oh, by the way, the other groups also sort of caught up. That's not how you measure a clinical trial. In a clinical trial, the only valid comparison is between the groups. You don't then say, oh, or people did, they sustained their benefits. Oh, these people got better as well, but we're not really going to pay attention to that. We're going to claim success based on the fact that people sustained their benefits. But the truth is, after 2.5 years, there were no differences between all the groups. So basically, it was a bust in terms of benefits. for CBT and GET. So basically, a huge thing was that in Alan Matthews, who's an Australian patient, filed a Freedom of Information request to get the original data, which the PACE authors were refusing to provide. Many people filed Freedom of Information requests. They classed them as vexatious, which is a legal term allowing you to refuse a Freedom of Information request in the UK. And they basically, I would say, defamed the entire patient community by claiming that they were getting all these harassment and all this kind of stuff. Now, I don't doubt that they were getting probably a lot of mean emails, and I'm sure that they were getting a lot of pushback. So I'm not denying that they were getting unpleasant emails. However, that doesn't justify what they did scientifically, and it doesn't justify withholding their data from patients, and it doesn't justify excusing that on the basis of requests being vexatious when patients really only wanted to know what the hell was going on with the findings that they had promised to provide when they got funded. That's why you do a protocol. Your funding is approved based on what you promised to do. They didn't do what they promised to do. They did something completely other. And that's why patients were upset. Anyway, once the data was finally released and the tribunal dismissed in very scathing terms all the arguments that the PACE authors had raised for why they could not provide this data, once that data was released, then reanalyses were able to be done, and it became clear that it became impossible to deny what was already self-evident, that all the changes they made in their outcome measures made it easier to have findings that were attractive to report. Nothing, maybe a coincidence, but they didn't make anything more difficult to find improvement or recovery. They made everything much easier. So everything got amplified multiple times. From 7%, as Brian pointed out, they had 22% recovery, okay? You can't do that. You just can't do this stuff. So it changed basically their null, or what I would say placebo effects, into attractive findings. They were able to report attractive improvement in the Lancet and recovery in psychological medicine. So here are some of the responses. One of the things that I was able to do, so I want to make it clear that everything I did, I piggybacked on the incredible analysis that patients had done, and the patients are amazing in terms of doing this analysis. So I kind of at first was reading, people are recovered at baseline on measures. The patients really have to be wrong. That can't be possible. Nobody could publish such a paper. Well, then you look, oh my God, they did. So I got into this because I showed it to my colleagues at Berkeley, and they just said, this is incredible, you really should report about this. And so as part of what I did that patients had difficulty doing was that because of my position at Berkeley and because I knew a lot of people and epidemiologists and biostatisticians, I could get people from outside the field to come and look at this and tell me this is a piece of garbage. So this was my favorite quote in my whole piece. This is the height of clinical trial amateurism. So anybody who's worked in research knows that scientists really, really, really do not want to get involved in trashing other people's work if they're not involved in an actual dispute with them. They'll criticize work in their own field. They won't go out of their way to say nasty things about other people's work. In this case, the study is so egregious that it really wasn't that difficult to have scientists say things like this. Ron Davis at Stanford, so many of you know his son is really seriously ill, so he has a vested interest, and some of his work gets dismissed on that basis. So he was shocked that the Lancet published it. Jonathan Edwards, who's a retired rheumatologist from University College London, he said, it's a massive incomprehensibility to me. Professor Art Reingold is my department head. He's the head of epidemiology at Berkeley. He said he thought there should be an independent review. I've repeatedly called it a piece of crap. Carol Monaghan, who is an MP from Scotland, who had some contact with a patient, that's how she found out about it, and she's called it one of the biggest medical scandals of the 21st century. When I met with her, I said, well, don't you actually think it's one of, even though we're only 18 years into the millennium, it's actually one of the biggest scientific scandals of this millennium? She wouldn't go that far, because who knows what's going to happen in the rest of the millennium, but I think it's a pretty big, ridiculous scandal. And the scandal is twofold. The scandal is that they did it in the first place, and the secondary scandal is that it was published and that it was accepted as legitimate science. And the tertiary scandal, I suppose, is that it's been accepted and you can't even get any, it's been so hard to get any traction to get anybody to acknowledge that it's a piece of crap, which it is. So this is my 15,000 word expose, and then I did many follow-ups. And my colleague at Columbia, Vincent Rocaniello, was amazing because he basically read it and said, looks good, let's go with it. So basically, it's very clear to me that if I had been wrong, we both could have lost our houses, right? I mean, if I were wrong, they could have really, really filed a major lawsuit. But I wasn't wrong. They claimed that I was wrong, but they never came up with any. If they could have sued us, they would have sued us from the beginning. So, they've decided not to because they'd have to actually explain their science, and well, we'll go on. So this is what happened after my series. Because it didn't get any traction, I came up with, I thought was a good idea, which was start writing these open letters and get people to sign them. And, what's been frustrating for the PACE authors, I think, is that I've just refused to do this in an academically genteel way, writing letters and hoping somebody publishes them. Hey, I have a blog that people read. I'm a reporter. I know a lot of journalists, so I can sort of use my whatever to get word out, and that's what I did. There was coverage after Science, the journal Science, when my series ran. They wrote about it in conjunction with the new paper that they published. Once this open letter ran, we had 42 signatures from Harvard, Columbia, Berkeley, University College London, people, very well-regarded people. The Lancet just kind of ignored it or blew it off. The PACE authors sort of have somehow convinced themselves that all these people are insane and all these people don't know anything about science. So basically, I did another open letter to Psychological Medicine. That one had, I think, more than 101 experts, because that one is really egregious. And then I started adding organizations. They've just ignored these letters. However, the letters have gotten some attention in the scientific world, and they got some attention in the media world, and they started kind of some momentum of, unraveling of the situation. So anyway, yes, and so in August, we had this new open letter, and I made sure that it got to people who needed to know about it, and it was written up in the Times. To me, the Times is the New York Times. I mean, to you, the Times is the Times, the UK Times. And then the next day, the BMJ had a news article about it, which was really, I think, important because, again, a lot of people saw that. A lot of people read that, even if they don't know all the details. It's really important to have coverage of the stuff. And there's been, basically, journalists have been, for the most part, especially in the UK, but in the US also, it's very hard to write things and say this Lancet article is a piece of shit, even if it is. It's very hard to counter, professors in the UK. It's very hard to get anybody to pay attention, if you're poking holes, even if it's bad research, when the entire establishment has weighed in and accepted this as valid. I'm sure Brian could talk a lot about this. It's sort of like a mass delusion or maybe mass hysteria on the part of the entire UK academic establishment. And most of them are men, so let's put the hysteria on them. They're all insane. It's not you, it's not me, it's not Brian. Those people are insane, literally, to be looking at this and saying, this is a good study. Anybody in their right mind, any 5-year-old could tell you, Mommy, I can't what do you mean I have a cold and I don't have a cold right now? That's not possible. A 5-year-old knows that's not possible. It should have been evident to anybody who read the paper. It shows that there was absolutely zero effort at legitimate peer review. Any peer reviewer, if it wasn't just their best friends, and I think probably what was happening, we don't know, they're all peer reviewing each other's work. In the US, we would call this a circle jerk. For those of you, excuse my language, but that's what we call this in, in camp in 7th grade. That's what these people have been doing for decades, I think. You can see I get very agitated, and I probably say things in a way that I shouldn't, and I'm not very diplomatic about it because I'm fed up with these people and I'm fed up with the situation, and I didn't set out to spend 3 or 4 years doing this. That's not what I intended to do. I'm only doing it because it's necessary and because nobody else, because I don't know, because I'm astonished that it's taken this long to get to this point. So let's talk about the outcome switching with our these are sort of, I wrote 15,000 words. I couldn't even touch everything that was wrong with the study. So there's a lot more, but these are sort of some core things. So Brian talked about the outcome switching. I've been talking a lot about lack of informed consent because we'll talk about that. And then this this newsletter, this bizarre newsletter that they sent out, which again, all these things they have justifications for. And then the study design, basically, as Brian said, the study design itself delegitimizes the study. So you don't actually need to have all these bad things going on to look at the study and say, the findings are kind of uninterpretable. You can't really know what's biased and what's not, the findings as they reported them. So you don't need to point these things out, but it's good to point them out anyway. So the outcome switching, Brian talked about that. So I'm not even gonna go into details, but the point is that only when someone filed a Freedom of Information request, so it was clear from the studies that it was theoretically possible that some people already had met these outcome thresholds at baseline after they changed both the fatigue and the physical function. But you didn't know how many, or if anyone, or how many, because you didn't have the data. Someone actually asked for the data, and for some reason I don't understand, someone gave them the data, even though they were withholding other data. So then it became clear that 13% of the participants in the study already had met the recovery threshold, the revised recovery threshold for physical function when they entered the study. So you have people in the study who had no business being in the study if that was actually a recovery threshold. And as again, you could be 65 to enter the study, 65 or worse, but you were recovered at 60 or better. It's actually, I mean, I keep saying insane, but that's insane. It is insane. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, so they did the same thing with the fatigue, but it's more complicated because the scale's kind of backwards and stuff. And it only, I think, 3 or 8, I can't remember how many, 3 or 8, 1% of the participants had already recovered for fatigue at baseline. So what were their answers? We changed outcome measures before seeing the results, so they were pre-specified. This is ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. When you have an open label trial, and everybody knows who's in what arm, and especially you're having subjective outcomes, unless you're incredibly stupid as a principal investigator, you're very likely to know not the specific data, but the trends of the data. You know who's in what trial, you know how people are responding. So so the fact that it was after they collected their data, they can't then just call it pre-specified just because they say they didn't look at the data. Pre-specified, they can't, many times in this thing, I've found that they're trying to rewrite the English language. Pre-specified means before the study starts, in your protocol, you cannot collect your data and then call it pre-specified. It's preposterous. We decided our original measures were too stringent. Then why write a protocol in the first place? Why just not do your study and then pick all your outcome measures afterwards? If that's what you can do, you can't do that. That's why you write a protocol. It doesn't matter that people were recovered on key variables because we had other recovery measures as well. Okay, I mean, I don't even know what to say about that. There's a famous Groucho Marx line where he says, these are my principles. If you don't like these principles, I can have some other principles. That's what they're doing. Well, we didn't like, people are recovered on this, but don't worry about that. We have other measures that they did well on. I'm sorry, you can't do that. And especially because these were the two principal measures. The other two recovery measures that Brian pointed out were sort of somewhat secondary, and they weakened both of those also. Right, okay, so their revised primary measure, originally in their protocol, they were supposed to produce rates of how many people improved, how many people recovered, what percentage recovered. Their primary outcome in Lancet, as it was published, was an average of how they averaged the rates of everybody, the findings of everybody in the groups, and they said on average, these people did somewhat better. Now, that's interesting, but it's not as interesting as knowing, and it's not as important as knowing how many people got better and how many people got worse. If we all averaged, an average doesn't tell you how many, it just tells you an average. So basically, let's say Bill Gates was in here, and we all averaged our wealth. Well, we'd all seem to have an incredibly rich whatever, but that wouldn't be the case. It would be Bill Gates has all the money and we have nothing, right? So an average doesn't tell you what clinicians and what patients want to know. How many people got better? How many people didn't? How many people got worse? The average is interesting, but essentially unhelpful in terms of making clinical decision making. So, they also claimed that they tweaked, when we did the reanalysis, they were arguing, when people did the reanalyses, they were arguing that the reanalyzers tweaked the measures to make it look worse, to make it harder. That's not true. The reanalyzers untweaked the tweaking that they themselves did to make their measures look better. So really what was going on was just untweaking what they had tweaked. So to blame people who reanalyzed for tweaking, which really was just using their own measures that they had promised to provide, is ridiculous. It's just also ridiculous. I can't even say that enough. Whoops. Oh, sorry. There. Okay, so this is a big thing for me, but it doesn't seem to bother anybody else. In their protocol, they promised, when you write a protocol, you say, we're going to abide by this and that ethical guidelines. So in 2000, now at this day and age, everybody has to acknowledge all their conflicts of interest. In 2005, things were a little more squishy because it wasn't quite clear how many people were getting funding from sources and having their studies influenced by conflicts of interest. However, unfortunately for the PACE authors, they promised in their protocol to abide by the Declaration of Helsinki. The Declaration of Helsinki is a human rights document, a human rights protocol that was developed I think first published in the 1960s, but it was sort of as an outcome of Nuremberg, and it basically was designed to protect human research subjects. And it's in the time when they did their study and their consent forms, it's very explicit about how you get informed consent. You have to inform prospective participants about any possible conflicts of interest and institutional affiliations. Well, the PACE authors, the three primary investigators, have long-standing ties, both with government agencies that are related to disability payments and welfare, and more importantly, not more importantly, but equally importantly, with commercial insurance companies that are deciding whether people should get disability benefits. And not only in some cases were they advising them in general that these treatments work, but they would be involved in, at least one of them that I've seen documentation, in specific cases and saying this person should not get, or this person shouldn't get benefits because they don't seem to have had CBT. So if that's your job, part of your job, and you're making income, or you're not even making income, but you're getting something benefits from that, that's actually a possible conflict of interest. And they were obligated by their protocol, by their promise to abide by the Declaration of Helsinki, to inform all their participants about this. They did not. Okay, you can't, so from my perspective, they have consent, but they have uninformed consent, and basically they had no legitimate ethical right to publish any of their data without informed consent. So what are their answers to this? We told the journals about our possible conflicts of interest. So this is complete bullshit, because basically the Declaration of Helsinki was written to protect human research subjects. It was not written to protect journal editors, and it was not written to protect journal readers. It was written to protect the people you're doing research on. So this is a complete non-response, a non-answer. It's like a diversion. Insurance companies were not involved in the study. Anybody involved in research knows, or anybody involved in anything should understand that conflict of interest is not solely about who's giving the money. It's about whether you yourself have a vested interest because of some outside interest in what you're going to be finding. Now, we all have vested interests, and they had reputational interests at stake in finding what they found, and Brian talked a little bit about that. But they also had reputational and economic interests they were already telling insurance companies that these things worked. At the same time, they were investigating them in this definitive trial. So the fact that the insurance companies didn't pay for the study is neither here nor there when we're talking about conflicts of interest. Only 3 of the 19 investigators did work for insurance companies. First, this was not true because there were 4. Second, so what? What kind of answer is that? I mean, I don't understand how they can provide these answers. So then you disclose those 3 people's conflicts of interest. What's the problem? So those are their answers. And again, I've tried to get there's been traction on some of the other stuff. I've gotten no traction with anybody on this problem, and I don't understand why. Because if I had done what they had done, I would be stripped of my doctorate at Berkeley, and if one did these kinds of things and it was found. So it's really beyond me to understand. This is one of my favorite things. They did a participant newsletter at a time in December 2008 when they still had a third of the people were still at some stage of the trial. So basically about 200 people. The newsletter had two things in it. It was a 6-page newsletter, so there were a batch of things in it. But there was a striking thing where they had one page where they had glowing testimonials from past participants. Now, oh, this trial is fantastic, and then they had a doctor who wrote in and saying his patient's so much better. They also had a wonderful message from 10 Downing Street. Now Gordon Brown was prime minister then, so probably nobody paid attention to it. But in any event, it was from 10 Downing Street, and you really don't want, it's really not appropriate to have, in our case, the president telling you how fantastic your trial is in the middle of the trial and have participants read that. It's just not done, but they did it. So these are some of the things. The therapy was excellent and very helpful. Being included has helped me tremendously. As you can see, they wrote the treatment, so they tried to hide they didn't disclose which arms of the study they were talking about, but it's kind of irrelevant. They were just still promoting the treatment or these things as a good thing, which, and then patients were reading it. And they also said that the NICE guidelines had come out the year before, and so they then included an article about the NICE guidelines in which they've noted that cognitive behavior therapy, graded exercise therapy, and something they call activity management were approved based on the best available evidence. So they're already telling their participants in both the two treatments that they're testing and the other comparison treatments that the two treatments of have already been proven to be effective. If that's the case, why do the study? Anyway, you can't do that. So what are their answers? The treatment arms were not mentioned in testimonials, so there could have been no bias. As I said, it's hard to know how to respond to this because it's such an unscientific, anti-scientific answer. You're biasing everybody possibly in your study in a positive direction. That's bias, whether it's non-directional bias or general bias, you're influencing everybody. And the fact is, it was very evident that some of these were that these were sort of active treatments for the most part. They said that they included somebody from every arm. In any event, you can't do it. You can't do what they did. The article about the NICE newsletter mentioned not just CBT, but activity management. And they were right, it did. But they claimed that activity management was the third treatment arm, even though in the study they called it adaptive pacing therapy. And in the study, they said adaptive pacing therapy was how we operationalized pacing, what everybody does is pacing, and that it's being tested for the first time in this trial. So how they could argue that activity management is the same thing as adaptive pacing therapy is hard for me to understand. I will point out that one of my colleagues at Berkeley, I showed the newsletter to, and I showed him the testimonials, and he was like really perplexed, which is the response I get often when you talk to people about the violations in the PACE trial. He was like, they published this during the trial? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, well, I guess there's no actual prohibition against publishing participant testimonials during a trial. He said, but I think that's because it never occurred to somebody that anybody would ever try such a thing. So that was, the thing with that. So, is PACE an example of research misconduct? So here are some examples of definitions from the MRC. Misrepresentation of data, for example, suppression of relevant findings and or data, or knowingly, recklessly, or by gross negligence presenting a flawed interpretation of data. Also from MRC, misrepresentation of interest, including failure to declare material interests either of the researcher or of the funders of the research. Falsification, this is from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the research record. So, one data point here. If 13% of your participants have met an outcome threshold at baseline and you have not disclosed that, I think that pretty much meets this definition of misrepresentation or suppression of data. I don't see how it can be argued any other way. Now, I'm not the adjudicator of whether PACE is research misconduct or not. I'm just expressing my personal opinion about it. I can't declare that it is, but it seems to me very much to match definitions of research misconduct. I would also say that not following your protocol and not in mentioning your possible conflicts of interest is misrepresentation of your interests, misrepresentation of your material interests. So I would argue that, seems to me that it could meet a definition of research misconduct. So here are the conclusions. Reported PACE results cannot be taken at face value and prove basically that treatments in the definitive trial didn't work. Here's the thing. If they had reported their findings as they actually got them and said, gee, I guess we were wrong. We didn't really have findings. It would have still have been a stupid study because it was the outcome measures, sort of open label and subjective findings, but at least they would have been honest researchers. That's not what they did. They changed everything, and as a result, they had findings that they felt, that presumably they felt they could report. The data manipulation, lack of informed consent, and other issues could lead to the conclusion that this is research misconduct according to standard definitions. The PACE authors have no legitimate defenses for their terrible methodological choices. They and their cronies are the anti-science crowd like climate change deniers, not PACE patients, or not MECFS patients. So the best use of PACE is as a pedagogical tool. It is used at Berkeley in epidemiology classes as an excellent case study of bad research. The students get it, graduate students get it for, or maybe it's undergraduate, I think. They get it for a month, they meet in groups, they tear it apart, and not physically like I have, but they tear the methodology apart, and then they give presentations to the class about how awful it is. That's really the best use of it. They've been given the world a really excellent example of bad research. And one thing I talk about Cochrane. How much time do I have? Am I running over? Should I stop soon? A couple of minutes? Okay. So one of the big problems, as many of you know maybe, the Cochrane reviews, Cochrane is a organization that does systematic reviews or meta-analyses. They look at all the research in a field, and then they add up all the data, because if you have many more people in a study, you tend to get more robust findings. So if you add everybody together from all the trials, then you can come up with sort of bigger findings, supposedly more robust. Lots of problems with Cochrane. First of all, chronic fatigue syndrome is in the common mental health disorders section where it doesn't belong. The Cochrane reviews report that CBT and GET have been shown to be effective by these systematic analyses. PACE is the largest study in Cochrane. They consider PACE has been rated as having a low risk of bias. Well, it has an incredibly high risk of bias, as do all the studies with open label trials with subjective outcomes. So basically, all the studies in these reviews have a very high risk of bias. Therefore, the entire review has a high risk of bias. Cochrane reviewers have not seen it that way because they're all part of the same kind of grouping, and they're all have links to each other in this. So it's all the same people doing these reviews as well as the ones doing the studies. Not exactly, but the people who are doing the reviews buy into the ideology or the cult of CBT and GET, as I've called it, because it's basically a theoretical basis or information without any theoretical foundation or without any legitimate theoretical foundation. Other reviews are Oxford studies, so that means that they have this very, very broad definition, so we don't actually know who's in the study. Are they just depressed people, or are they actually people with ME? There's a lot of pressure on Cochrane to reverse course. They're trying to figure out what to do. Unfortunately, Cochrane is now having an international blow-up over its entire structure, and so whether or not, how much they'll get to this or how soon they'll get to this, it's not completely clear. They've had another review that has been basically not been published, was going to be published last year, but Cochrane has not announced what they're planning to do with that. We do know, as I've reported, that it's gotten some very bad outside reviews because they sent it out for review, I guess recognizing they had issues with it. Cochrane sent it out for review to people not generally in bed with the same group of people, and those reviews came back awful. So Cochrane's trying to figure out what to do. So here are just a few things. In the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control a year ago removed cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy from recommendations. I've still been slamming them because they claim the reason they did it was because people misunderstood their recommendations. When nobody misunderstood, they're just trying to save face. It's actually disgraceful. I'm a public health professional, and this is supposed to be our lead public health agency, and they can't even get it together to make a statement that PACE is a piece of garbage. I find it incomprehensible as someone with a public health degree that my lead public health agency, I mean, I can find it because it's hard to believe my president too, but there are a lot of things going on in the world that are hard to understand, but this as a public health person I find despicable. NICE in the UK has last year, at first they said they weren't going to redo them. There's such an uproar that they decided that they would, and so they're involved in the process now, and they're planning to come out in 2020 with new guidance. Unfortunately, they're leaving the current guidance in place without any kind of warning sign or without any kind of thing that we're maybe these things aren't in such, maybe don't recommend CBT and GET until we actually do this new review. So they're still in place, just like the PACE study is still in place and not retracted. A Dutch advisory committee recommended that GET should not be used in the Netherlands. We're waiting for the Dutch Health Ministry, which should at some point soon make a determination as to what they're going to do with this recommendation. At Berkeley, it's used in epidemiology seminars. This is in Australia. I was in Australia when I first gave this talk. So in Australia, they have a big problem with this because they still have their own CBT, GET cult leaders. And the general practitioner, the GP group still recommends it based on PACE. So there's a whole kind of effort going on in Australia as well to try to do something about this. But these things seem to take more time than they should. Basically, that's the end of my talk. I first want to thank really the patients. And as I said, I've piggybacked on their work. I couldn't have done it without their brilliant analyses. That was incredibly important for me. I wouldn't have come upon it if I had not read their analyses, because I would have read it and said, looks like an okay study to me, if I hadn't actually sat down and focused on it. My colleague, Dr. Raccaniello, for trusting my reporting, because as I said, he read it and said, looks good to me. No one fact-checked it. I mean, I did, but, well, actually, that's not quite true. A previous version was fact-checked, and then it didn't get published for various reasons, but Virology Blog did not fact-check it. Ron Davis, so these are Ron Davis, Lenny Jason, Bruce Levin, Arthur Reingold. They were my 5 experts that were able to give me really fantastic quotes. And that was really what made the difference, I think, because I stacked those quotes at the top of my piece, and journalists love that. They can quote them, they can go to them. They were willing to say bad things about the trial to anybody who called them. At Berkeley, so as I've said, I've been had University of Bristol has filed multiple complaints now with me, with the chancellor. The vice chancellor's office at Bristol has filed multiple complaints about me with my chancellor, and Berkeley has said, well, well, I don't want to discuss my personal interaction, but basically, I'm still here giving talks, and I'm still here getting paid, and I'm still blogging, and I'm still at Berkeley. So you can take from that how much they thought about these complaints. The Center for Global Public Health is my home at Berkeley. They've been very supportive, and my colleagues everywhere, and every single person who agreed to sign my open letters, because I understand, especially in the UK, if you're in the UK and you're signing these letters, it can be very challenging, and people have gotten, some people, researchers in the ME community have gotten harassed, had people call their employers the way they've tried to get me sanctioned at Berkeley. So it's really been a challenging thing. I would not have not done this for the world. It's been one of the most bizarre but incredible projects I've been involved with. And so that's it. That's my show.